Last Tuesday at noon,
just
the
couldn't.
blistering heat of Manhattan was actively melting the ancient layers of asphalt into a sludge.
Oh my God, look
Leaning
at her.
against the rusted doorframe of the pawn
Someone call
shop,
the
I took a
police.
languid drag
you
from a
okay?
dying cigarette, my gaze adrift
She's
in the
gonna
blinding
collapse.
bleached light cascading from the towering skyscrapers. And then she appeared. Elena. It wasn't so much a run as a staggering, desperate crawl, like a wounded little beast that had just slipped the jaws of a leviathan, only to plummet straight into a pack of starving wolves. Amidst a drab forest of men hurrying by in charcoal suits, among the faded female clerk cloaked in the safety of corporate attire, Elena flared like a gaping, bleeding wound. She was poured into a dress of deep crimson silk, a bodycon evening gown that strangled every millimeter of her flesh. To the casual observer, she presented only a fiery hourglass silhouette, her heavy panic-stricken breasts heaving visibly beneath the sweat-drenched, gossamer silk. But to a gaze sharpened by years of scrubbing the underworld's filth, like mine, this was not seduction, it was sheer humiliating exposure. The gown's thigh-high slit had been violently ripped upward, exposing bare legs that wept blood, the brutal toll of fleeing in stilettos, never meant for the scorching asphalt pavement. Hundreds of gazes, judgmental, inquisitive, and ravenously lustful, pierced her hips and breasts like invisible, serrated blades. The shriek of police sirens tore through the air in deafening, oppressive bursts, echoing from the avenue's intersection in a suffocating crescendo. The only anchor keeping her from total collapse, the solitary object she clutched fiercely against her sternum, was an albino crocodile Hermès Birkin bag. Have you ever been driven to the absolute brink, stripped of your final, fragile layer of dignity, and discarded onto the street like a mangled toy by the very person you believed to be your lifelong sanctuary? Pause for a second. Leave a yes or no in the comments below. I truly need to know what kind of audience I am unearthing this tale for. My name is Silas, and this is the chronicle of how I taught an imperious billionaire a terrifying truth. The deadliest weapon on earth is not ungodly wealth, but a woman who has absolutely nothing left to lose. High noon in Manhattan does not resemble a city. It is a monolithic crematorium constructed of concrete, tempered glass, and utter apathy. The atmosphere congealed, choked with the acrid stench of melting tar, the exhaust fumes belched by delivery trucks, and the bitter tang of scorched coffee. The sheer cacophony of this metropolis is, in itself, a form of invisible violence. The blaring of car horns, the frantic staccato of heels striking the pavement, elves barking into phones over multi-million-dollar contracts. All of it coalesced into a suffocating auditory membrane designed to strangle any cry for salvation. Elena darted across the avenue, narrowly evading the grille of a yellow cab that blasted its horn in blind rage. The zenith sun beat down vertically, carving short, razor-sharp black shadows onto the boiling asphalt. Under that unforgiving, merciless glare, the grandeur of her crimson silk gown metamorphosed into an instrument of torture. This superlative fabric, engineered to whisper across velvet carpets beneath the muted glow of crystal chandeliers at opulent galas, now fused suffocatingly to her sweat-slicked skin. It dug into her waspish waist, constricting her apple-shaped hips and voluptuous curves with an agonizing tightness. The garment offered no concealment, it only exposed. It reduced her to a grotesque alien specimen, ludicrously and pitifully marooned amidst the surging tide of pedestrians. Swallowed by the shadows of my awning, I narrowed my eyes at the woman frantically hunting for sanctuary. Her face, once meticulously sculpted by layers of exorbitant cosmetics, was a ruined canvas. Mascara bled in murky obsidian rivulets beneath profound blue eyes that were blown wide with terror. Her luscious red lips were cracked, parting to gulp down mouthfuls of the blistering air. She staggered forward, every agonizing footfall on her 5-inch Christian Louboutin stilettos, threatening to sever her very tendons. The stairs. That was the truest, most sadistic executioner. The suited men gliding past allowed their gazes to slither from her violently heaving chest down to the shredded slit of her gown, their mouths twisting into lecherous, knowing smirks. The women, clutching their sensible briefcases, turned their heads, murmuring in hushed tones, their eyes glinting with pure disdain for what they presumed to be a ruined socialite left to rot from the night before. Not a single soul stepped forward. Not a single hand was extended. In this metropolis, the utter degradation of another human being is merely theatrical fodder to entertain the masses on their lunch hour. Her heel caught on a jagged manhole cover. Equilibrium vanished, and her body pitched violently forward. Instinct should have thrown her hands out to brace for the brutal impact, but no. Those frail arms remained rigidly locked around the albino crocodile Hermès Birkin, crushing it against her breast, opting instead to let her knees smash mercilessly into the blistering pavement. Flesh was torn away. Blood began to well, pooling with her sweat before dripping in thick, viscous droplets onto the crimson tips of her shoes. She desperately tried to drag herself up, but her legs had been drained of all life. It was in that shattered moment that her frantic gaze collided with the glacial chill of my own. My pawnshop sat entombed between two gleaming glass monoliths, a dark, archaic cavern drowned in a pool of silent shadow. It stood like a scavenged den of the underworld that had mistakenly ruptured the polished surface of modern capitalism. Without a shred of hesitation, I flicked my cigarette to the concrete, ground it to dust beneath my heel, and strode toward the curb. I seized her wrist. It was freezing to the touch and vibrating with violent tremors, and violently hauled the woman in red silk out of the incinerating glare. "Please." Her voice was a shattered, gravelly whisper, as pitiful as the wheeze of a dying cat. "Please, lock the door, the police are hunting me." Because of this, I didn't utter a syllable. I shoved her over the threshold, slammed the heavy steel door shut, and aggressively engaged all three massive brass deadbolts. The harsh, metallic clanking severed us instantly from the avenue's chaotic roar. The blaring horns, the murmuring crowds, the suffocating heat, all of it was entombed outside. The violent shift in atmosphere caused the air in the shop to rapidly congeal. The stench of scorched asphalt was usurped by the rattling hum of an ancient air conditioner, the rot of decaying wood, thick dust, and the metallic, blood-like tang of rusted relics, waiting in vain to be redeemed by the desperate. The interior was swathed in a murky gloom, pierced only by a single, sickly shaft of light bleeding through the window blinds, illuminating the scarred surface of an oak desk in the center of the room. Elena slipped from my grasp, her back sliding down the rough grit of the wall until she hit the floor. She curled into a tiny, vibrating ball, her trembling fingers clawing at the disheveled ruins of her dress, desperately trying to manipulate the torn silk to veil the bare flesh exposed to the dim light. Her breaths were jagged, tearing violently at her lungs. She peered up at me, her eyes flooded with a pathetic, watery plea. Her hands, adorned with manicured nails that were now chipped and bleeding, slowly, reverently pushed the Hermes bag onto the wooden desk. "My accounts have been completely wiped. The black cards, the supplementary cards, even the secret debit card I had hidden away. All frozen solid," Elena whispered, each syllable weeping from her lips like fresh blood. "This morning he banished me from the Upper East Side penthouse. My clothes, my documents, my phone, he confiscated it all. He decreed that the only possessions I was allowed to leave with were the very clothes I wore to last night's gala, and this bag. I beg of you, I know you traffic in second-hand goods, buy it from me. 30,000, 10,000, I don't care. I need liquid cash to vanish before they hunt me down." I moved with deliberate slowness around the counter, dragged a decrepit stool out from the shadows, and sat down. I refused to glance at her shivering, statuesque legs, nor did I entertain the hypnotic rise and fall of her sensual chest. In my line of work, pity is a lethal toxin. Instead, I anchored my scrutiny entirely on the artifact resting upon the desk, a matte white Himalaya Niloticus crocodile Birkin, the apex of exclusivity. The reptilian scales were flawless, a spectral white bleeding seamlessly into an ashen gray, so agonizingly exquisite that the sheer stench of omnipotence and obscene wealth practically assaulted your olfactory senses. Within the clandestine rings of the black market, or behind the closed doors of private auctions, a specimen in this pristine condition could effortlessly command $300,000. Yet the primal instincts forged from years of sanitizing staged crime scenes screamed that something was catastrophically wrong here. It was a distortion so masterful, so insidious, that it sent a chill slithering down my spine. "You claimed he explicitly forced you to leave with this specific bag?" My voice was a low, gravelly drone, shattering the stagnant silence as I meticulously dissected every microscopic twitch on her ruined face. Elena nodded with manic desperation. A few moments ago, I attempted to purchase a mere glass of water at a corner cafe. The card was declined. Instantly, the manager accosted me. He declared that law enforcement had just broadcasted an emergency dispatch across the district's security grid. Grand larceny. My photograph, this exact crimson gown, and this very bag. An active warrant had been issued right in the heart of the city. She buried her face in her hands, her voice strangling on a sob. He reported me to the police as a common thief. He intends to cage me. A ghost of a smirk twisted the corner of my mouth. It was an arid, lifeless smile, completely devoid of warmth. I reached out and flicked on the desk lamp, angling its jaundiced beam to strike directly against the hide of the priceless Hermes. The harsh glare illuminated every meticulous, hand-sewn stitch crafted by French artisans. It was beautiful, immaculate, profoundly innocent, but I intimately understood the psychology of oligarchs. The absolute hubris of infinite wealth inevitably mutates them into tyrannical orchestrators of reality. They never initiate a move without a sinister calculus, and they never, under any circumstances, allow their prey the mercy of a private execution. Elena, I intoned her name with a slow, deliberate cadence, my hand drifting toward the black-handled carbon steel box cutter resting on the desk's edge. Think critically for a moment. A billionaire who wields the omnipotence to obliterate your financial existence in a heartbeat, who possesses the raw malice to flay away your dignity. Why would he not simply summon the authorities to arrest you in your own foyer? Why would he abstain from framing you for grand theft within the discreet, soundproofed walls of his own penthouse? She stared up at me in utter bewilderment, her quivering lips failing to construct a single syllable. Her eyes nervously tracked the icy glint of the steel blade in my grip. He discarded you onto the pavement at high noon, I continued, excising each layer of the truth with a vocal cadence as razor-sharp as my blade. The absolute zenith of the lunch-hour rush on the financial avenue. He ensured you were draped in the most radiant, provocative crimson gown imaginable, with a thigh-high slit that rendered concealment impossible, guaranteeing you could never dissolve into a sea of muted corporate gray. He systematically froze your assets to force you into the humiliating role of a beggar at open-air cafes. He has no desire to quietly apprehend a thief. He is choreographing a spectacular, public execution of your character. I laid my palm flat, the frigid hide of the Birkin, my thumb tracing the contours of its base seam. It felt imperceptibly dense, a microscopic aberration in its center of gravity, a phantom weight that could only be deciphered by fingertips calloused from appraising tens of thousands of illicit luxury artifacts. The atmosphere in the room solidified into ice. The ancient air conditioner rattled morbidly. Elena suspended her breathing, snicked. A crisp, sterile severing noise eviscerated the silence. The blade in my fist bore down, slicing effortlessly through a hidden stitch, concealed beneath the opulent silk lining along the inner flank of the Birkin. Elena violently flinched, but I did not afford her a pause. I maneuvered the tip of the carbon steel into the freshly birthed surgical incision, delicately prying it open. A sleek, obsidian metallic module, scarcely larger than a bottle cap, plummeted from the silk womb and clattered sharply against the wooden desk. I tapped the blunt edge of my blade against its casing. A military-grade, micro-GPS transponder, waterproof architecture, powered by a kinetic cell capable of hemorrhaging a continuous signal for 3 solid months. A sickly, pulsing crimson lead throbbed sporadically across its black shell, rhythmic and merciless as the beating of a mechanical heart. "You are not a thief, Elena," I murmured, sliding the sinister device toward the edge of the desk, my stare drilling into the profound, paralyzing horror welling up within the woman's azure eyes. "You are the prey, and this is the electronic leash he has securely fastened around your neck." I sank back into the shadows of my chair and ignited a fresh cigarette. The erratic spark of the Zippo bathed the severe, jagged contours of my face in fleeting gold. Acrid smoke snaked upward, weaving itself into the suffocating gloom of the room. At this very second, law enforcement isn't aimlessly patrolling for a vague silhouette draped in scarlet. They are navigating toward a meticulously broadcasted coordinate, accurate to the exact meter. And believe me, loitering right at the intersection outside, a swarm of bottom-feeding paparazzi, pre-purchased by your dear husband, are crouching in ambush with their telephoto lenses primed. I exhaled a thick plume of gray, locking eyes with her absolute abyssal despair. When the patrolmen cuff you, grinding your face into the melting asphalt as hundreds of spectators watch. High-definition captures of a shattered, warish little wife caught embezzling her lord's fortune will infect every tabloid front by dawn. Favorable divorce proceedings? Evaporated. Custodial rights? A fantasy. Your equitable half of the empire? You will be marching through the gates of a federal penitentiary with absolutely nothing to your name. The sheer weight of the revelation obliterated her. She buried her face in her palms, her chest convulsing as violent, choked, and deeply embittered sobs ripped from her throat. The haughty pride of a billionaire's consort had been utterly pulverized, leaving behind nothing but a naked, terrified creature awaiting the coup de grace from the man she once slept beside. Yet, the apex predators always overlook one critical flaw. The blinding arrogance of immense wealth always harbors a fatal blind spot. That billionaire was fundamentally intoxicated by the flawless architecture of his own script. He calculated with chilling certainty that his prey, once cornered, would instinctively clutch the cursed bag and flee in a blind, pathetic panic until her legs gave out. He never factored in an anomaly, a rogue variable in the shape of this decaying pawnshop, and he most certainly could never fathom that the man currently cradling his tracking chip is a specialist in weaponizing the most immaculate traps, transforming them into the suffocating graves of the hunters themselves. The trajectory of this multi-billion-dollar divorce would no longer be litigated within a mahogany courtroom. Its bloody conclusion rested right here upon the splintered surface of my oak desk. The malignant red strobe emitting from the chip seemed to cannibalize what little oxygen remained in the stagnant air. 1 pulse, 2 pulses, 3 pulses. With every flare of that crimson lead, it painted a phantom smear of cold blood across Elena's ashen cheekbone. And then the primal, unrefined survival instinct of a cornered animal detonated. Elena lunged from her slump, her sinewy, trembling hands clawing violently at the microchip with a maniacal ferocity. Her stool violently careened backward, crashing against the hollow floorboards with an ear-shattering crack. She hyperventilated, her lungs violently fighting against the ribcage beneath the sweat-drowned crimson silk. "I have to dispose of it. I have to pulverize it. Throw it down the sewer." Her shrieks were jagged, fragmenting into shards of pure hysteria, her cerulean eyes dilabyssal terror. She spun on her heels, preparing to hurl herself toward the front door, toward the blinding, asphyxiating white furnace of the afternoon sun waiting just outside. But before the ruined tip of her stiletto could even graze the threshold, my hand shot out from the gloom, clamping around her wrist like a vice of iron, clinical, precise, utterly merciless. The freezing, slippery slick of terror sweet coating her flesh bled into my palm, transmitting a frantic, erratic pulse, like the frantic flutterings of a dying sparrow trapped inside a crushed ribcage. "Let me go. They're closing in. The police are coming." Elena thrashed wildly, her manicured claws raking frantically across the back of my hand, carving deep, bloody lacerations into my skin. The pawnshop's atmosphere, already choked with the stench of oxidized iron and decaying timber, grew exponentially denser, polluted by the bitter, metallic tang of absolute, primal terror. I tightened my grip, employing the cold, calculated leverage of a man who had spent a lifetime subduing the most psychotic panic states and violently yanked her back into the abyss of the shadows. Elena's spine collided brutally with the rough, grit-encrusted plaster of the wall. I closed the distance instantly, pinning her arm immovably against the brickwork, driving my gaze directly into her blown, terror-stricken pupils. "Listen to me," I snarled, though the volume barely slipped past my gritted teeth, a low guttural vibration as harsh and frigid as metal shearing against metal. "To run is to confess that you are nothing but prey. If you breach that door and hurl this tracker into the gutter, the authorities will uncover a half-naked, hysterical socialite in possession of stolen property, actively attempting to destroy criminal evidence." They will violently press your throat into the boiling asphalt outside, snap the cuffs onto your wrists, and a legion of smartphone cameras will gleefully crucify you on the front page of every tabloid rag by dawn. He constructed this maze specifically so you would run. If you run, you perish. Elena's frenzied breathing abruptly stalled. Her chapped, bloodied lips quivered violently. The combative tension locked within her musculature slowly dissolved, evaporating in the face of the bone-chilling absolute of my stare. She slowly slid down the coarse wall, collapsing onto the scarred floorboards into a heap of defeated silk, her hands burying her mascara-ruined face. A pathetic, whimpering sob rattled deep within her throat, unable to fully escape. I released her wrist and stepped back. The tableau before me was ripped straight from the most despairing canvas of a neo-noir nightmare. An exquisite siren, draped in exorbitant crimson silk, her voluptuous hourglass silhouette previously flaunting the pinnacle of carnal allure, now reduced to a shuddering pile of human wreckage beneath the jaundiced, sickly glow of a dilapidated pawnshop. I reached for my crumpled pack of cigarettes on the desk and slowly extracted a single stick. The crinkling of the foil wrapper echoed sharply in the oppressive quiet. The rasping friction of the Zippo's flint wheel striking steel sparked a meager, trembling flame before I inhaled deeply. The acrid, biting veil of tobacco smoke uncoiled toward the ceiling, temporarily masking the foul, metallic stench of her raw terror. "Drink," I ordered, jutting my chin toward an opened bottle of water resting atop a glass display case, a graveyard housing pawned rollicles that would never see the wrists of their owners again. "Hydrate to clear the fog, and then use your intellect to answer my question. In the blood sport of the aristocracy, tears do not purchase clemency. They merely serve as a seasoning, designed to stimulate the palate of the predator." Elena's trembling fingers reached out to claim the plastic bottle. The water spilled over the corners of her lips, cascading down the pale column of her throat to drench the bodice of her silk gown. She drew in fragmented, rattling breaths, desperately attempting to stitch together the shattered remnants of her dignity. A man who has just successfully triggered a flawless snare, a trap of such diabolical sophistication that it banishes his wife to the gallows without a speck of blood soiling his own cuffs. What exactly is he doing at this precise moment? I delivered the inquiry in a deadpan drone, exhaling a plume of silver-gray smoke toward the water-stained ceiling. He is certainly not pacing in his foyer, anxiously awaiting a courtesy call from the precinct. Megalomaniacal billionaires possess an insatiable vanity. They require an audience to properly consecrate their victories. "Where is he, Elena?" She raised her head, her bloodshot, vacant eyes taking a long, arduous moment to synchronize with my logic. "He, Arthur." Her voice was a grating croak. "Today is Tuesday, 12:30 in the afternoon. He strictly adheres to his lunch schedule." "Where and with whom?" I interrogated, my pacing glacial but burdened with the crushing weight of an anvil. "Le Bernardin," she gasped out, clamping her eyes shut as if the mere invocation of the establishment's name plunged a dagger straight through her sternum. "The five-star sanctum in Midtown. He perpetually reserves the corner booth, flush against the floor-to-soiling glass, so he can observe the peasants scurrying on the pavement below and with that vile creature, his god-forsaken mistress, a 22-year-old runway model, they pre-planned a celebratory feast. He bragged to her that by noon today the unpleasantness would be concluded. He promised he would permanently incinerate the human garbage, meaning me, to pave her triumphant entry into the penthouse." A sinister, desiccated smirk, utterly devoid of humanity, slowly contorted the corner of my mouth. "Le Bernardin, high noon. An exorbitant vintage of Chateau Margaux, plates of decadence sculpted like Renaissance art, and a nubile paramour intimately stroking his thigh beneath the pristine drape of a white damask tablecloth. That bastard oligarch was currently basking in the zenith of his artificial glory, smugly convinced that his labyrinthine plot was ticking along with the flawless precision of a Swiss chronometer. He inherently believed that in some filthy, sun-baked gutter, merely a few blocks away, the armed forces of the state were violently crushing his breathtaking wife into the pavement, surgically excising her of all autonomy, wealth, and dignity. That is the terrifying pathology of ungodly wealth, an arrogance so profound it induces absolute blindness. An exquisite venue for an execution banquet, I murmured, turning my back on Elena and marching slowly toward the cavernous rear of the shop. The heavy tread of my leather boots striking the hollow floorboards birthed a somber, dirge-like echo. The rear sanctum was partitioned by a drapery of burgundy velvet, tattered, moth-eaten, and choked with decades of dust. Parting that curtain was akin to crossing the threshold into a parallel dimension. The ambient temperature plummeted violently, becoming as glacial and crypt-damp as a mausoleum. The rot of leather-bound grimoires, the sharp, chemical tang of weapon-grade gun oil, and the corroded stench of oxidized brass were inextricably woven into a suffocating miasma. Swallowed by the gloom in the furthest corner, concealed behind wrought-iron shelving, burdened with dead, stringless guitars and tarnished bronze idols, crouched a monolithic cast-steel safe. Roughly the size of an industrial icebox, it bore the faded insignia of an antiquated Diebold relic from a bygone century. I stood squarely before the monolith, pressing my palm against its freezing iron face. My fingers, digits scarred by the bloody, high-stakes diffusals of my former life as an underworld fixer, began to manipulate the heavy combination dial. Clack, 45 rotations clockwise. Clack, 20 rotations counterclockwise. Clack, 73 rotations clockwise. The subterranean grind of colossal steel deadbolts shearing against one another groaned through the shop, mimicking the sickening crunch of fractured bone. I violently wrenched the lever. The gargantuan iron door swung ajar, vomiting a frigid exhalation saturated with the unmistakable stench of the criminal abyss. The vault housed neither currency nor jewels. It served solely as a crypt for the detritus, the toxic shrapnel of old, dismantled traps I had neutralized for cartel overlords before vanishing into civilian obscurity. I plunged my arm into the deepest recess of the vault, extracting a densely packed, vacuum-sealed brick of thick, poly plastic. It bore the heavy, dead weight of roughly 2 kilograms. The pathetic seepage of ambient light was sufficient to illuminate the compacted, crystalline white powder imprisoned within the plastic, a brick of superlative synthetic narcotics, unstepped, uncut, weapons-grade contraband. This was war spoils violently repossessed from a Mexican cartel kingpin several winters ago after he made the fatal miscalculation of refusing payment for a particularly grotesque cleanup operation. I had never purged it from my inventory. In the grim business of sweeping up the viscera left by demons, one inevitably requires a radiological dirty bomb to properly execute a monster who prides himself on his immaculate, unstained cuffs. Clamping the brick of cocaine under my arm, I hurled the vault door shut and pivoted toward the storefront. The glacial density of the narcotics pressing against my ribs triggered a venomous electrical surge through my nervous system, violently resurrecting a dormant, sadistic instinct I had long thought buried. As I breached the velvet veil, Elena remained slumped in the dust, her dilated pupils immediately locked onto the vacuum-sealed block in my grip. A fresh, paralyzing wave of horror began to ignite, slithering viciously through the profound exhaustion that masked her exquisite features. What is that?" she stammered, instinctively dragging her body backward. The friction of the crimson silk dragging across the splintered floorboards birthed a harsh, nerve-shredding hiss. I offered no immediate sanctuary of an answer. Indifferent to her escalating terror, I stalked to the wooden desk and slammed the brick of narcotics down beside the GPPS transponder, which continued its patient, bloody pulsing. The plastic brick struck the timber with a dull, concussive thud, exhaling a spectral cloud of decaying wood dust into the shaft of light. The violent visual dichotomy was stark and uncompromising. The crimson strobe of the lethal, modern tracking module, the sheer embodiment of the billionaire's omnipotent control, sprawled inches from the pristine, unholy white brick of contraband, the physical manifestation of an irrefutable lifetime prison sentence. Planting both palms on the edge of the desk, I leaned aggressively forward, casting my sprawling, monolithic shadow over both instruments of ruin. The claustrophobic walls of the pawnshop seemed to physically contract. The morbid rattling of the overhead exhaust fan morphed into the dreadful ticking of a doomsday clock. "I am not an agent of the law, Elena," I murmured in a subsonic register, a frequency entirely void of empathy, morality, or salvation. It was the pure, unfiltered cruelty of an apex survivor. I harbor zero reverence for esoteric concepts of justice or the pathetic charades of a courtroom truth. My sole fascination lies in the physiological mechanics of a trap. Your illustrious husband has painstakingly engineered a flawless theatrical tragedy. He deployed the police. He weaponized a satellite coordinate. He contracted an army of paparazzi. He erected a magnificent, sunlit coliseum for the singular purpose of burying a human being alive. I paused, my fingers delicately pinching the microchip. The predatory red beam washed over the calloused ridge of my thumb. This beacon is the beating heart of his performance. If we sever it or flush it into the sewers, he will suffer only a momentary disappointment before safely returning to his vintage wine at Le Bernardin. And tomorrow? Tomorrow, he will merely unchain a different breed of hound to rip you to shreds. Elena rose to her feet with agonizing slowness. Her bare, lacerated soles gripped the grimy floorboards. The frantic heaving of her voluptuous chest beneath the gossamer silk ceased in a suspended heartbeat, as the sheer demonic gravity of my implication finally took root in her mind. Her gaze ping-ponged from the pulsating transponder to the narcotic brick and finally locked onto my face. A terrifying necrotic dawn of comprehension ignited within her irises. Then, "What exactly are you going to do?" Her voice had been bled dry of panic, replaced by an icy, jagged resonance, the tone of a woman actively being hypnotized by the resident devil of this sanctuary. "My philosophy is brutally simple," I sneered, plunging the tip of the blade into the vacuum seal, opening a surgical cleft in the plastic before burying the pulsating module deep into the snow-white bowels of the cocaine. "We do not demolish his amphitheater. We deliver his death warrant to its rightful architect. We are going to smuggle this poison straight under his arrogant nose, execute a violent recast of the lead actor, and allow the billionaire's magnum opus to snap his own silken, bespoke neck." Hoisting the rigged package of narcotics, I turned to face Elena. Amidst the suffocating rot, the suspended dust, and the stench of my pawn shop, bathed in the sickly wash of the filament bulb, the siren in the crimson silk had undergone a grotesque metamorphosis. She was no longer a victim. She was a weaponized explosive of pure vengeance, and her pin had just been pulled. "Wipe your face, madam," I commanded, tossing my heavy, frayed canvas trench coat at her feet. "Shroud yourself in that. We have a very pressing lunch reservation waiting for us in the VIP parking lot of Le Bernardin, right in the blinding glare of high noon." The frayed, coarse canvas of the trench coat dragged over Elena's frail shoulders, its drab, abrasive fabric violently smothering the radiant allure of the crimson silk, swallowing her lethal seduction into a crude, shadowy mass. The stale odor of tobacco embedded in the weave, compounded by the sour stench of sweat from a garment never properly laundered, seemed to drag the oligarch's wife down to the absolute of reality. Yet simultaneously, it armored her in the perfect cloak of invisibility. The pawn shop door wrenched open. The superheated, gelatinous atmosphere of the Manhattan noon instantly assaulted us like the backhand of a demon. The asphalt steamed ominously, reflecting a blinding, agonizing white glare. We vaulted into the cabin of my decaying Ford pickup tethered near the alley's mouth. The steel doors slammed shut, entombing us in a sweltering iron cage. The stench of sun-baked vinyl upholstery, suffocatingly spliced with the reek of leaking gasoline and the cold, terrified sweat beating on Elena's forehead, forged an atmosphere so utterly asphyxiating that drawing a single breath required Herculean effort. I twisted the ignition. The engine snarled with tubercular cough before vibrating violently, accompanied by the death rattle of a shattered air conditioning unit capable of spitting out nothing but parched, hissing gusts. I buried the throttle. The rusted beast crept out of the umbral alley, merging into the sluggish, crawling arteries of the avenue. The polyplastic brick of pure cocaine, now pregnant with the blinking red eye of the transponder, sat enthroned on the center console between us. The melancholic beep, beep pulsed with the methodical rhythm of the grim reaper knocking at the door. The police were hunting that frequency. The distance was collapsing. The phantom pressure crushed the claustrophobic cabin, strangling Elena's erratic breaths. She cowered against the passenger door, her knuckles blanched white as they strangled the lapels of the trench coat, her dilated eyes locked in a death stare upon that lethal crimson strobe. Terror only accelerates your heart rate and guarantees a fatal error, I grumbled, hauling the steering wheel to bank into a desolate side street. Inhale deeply. Strangle your pulse. We are chauffeuring a thermonuclear device, and the only trigger is your panic. 20 agonizing minutes later, we breached Midtown. The architectural anatomy of the city mutated. Crumbling brick facades surrendered to towering, megalithic fortresses of reinforced glass, ricocheting the brutal solar glare down upon immaculate granite pavements. Le Bernardin stood imperiously at the corner, cocooned in a profound, hushed reverence that belongs exclusively to sanctuaries where wealth has successfully bribed away the noise of the world. I docked the truck in a blind alleyway, separated from the restaurant's open-air VIP parking lot by a rigidly manicured barricade of juniper bushes. Through the serrated foliage beneath a punishing, cloudless sky, dozens of exotic vehicles lay dormant like obedient, million-dollar beasts, no armed sentries, no security barricades. It was the exact pathology I had diagnosed, the arrogance of capital. The hyper-rich implicitly believe that the regal aura radiating in their Bentley, Porsches, and Rolls-Royces generates a magical force field, repelling any lower-class vermin from daring to scratch paint jobs worth a lifetime of proletarian labor. A sublimely beautiful blind spot. My gaze raked the asphalt lot, snapping immediately to the absolute epicenter. There sat the pearlescent, gleaming chassis of a Tesla Model S Plaid, customized vanity plates, blinding chrome trim. The chariot of the 22-year-old concubine. A cunning oligarch never pilots his own vessel to a rendezvous with his mistress while actively orchestrating the public crucifixion of his wife. I killed the engine. Snatching the brick of compressed narcotics and its blinking parasite, I shoved the package into the cavernous pocket of my coat, simultaneously extracting a digital cipher key no larger than a cigarette pack from the glove box. "Do not move. Do not breach that door. Do not expose your face," I instructed Elena. She nodded, her teeth sinking into her lower lip until it threatened to bleed, her widened eyes tracking my descent from the cabin. The thermal radiation radiating off the asphalt lashed at my legs, blowing a furnace blast against my face. I popped my collar and moved with a terrifyingly casual saunter through the juniper hedge. The heavy thud of my leather boots against the tarmac was muffled, yet authoritative. My spine was drenched in sweat, 2-kilogram mass of cocaine hammering against my ribs with every stride, a leaden pendulum dragging the human psyche down into a quagmire of sin. Flanking the rear of the Tesla, I paused. The atmosphere was thickened by an eerie, funereal silence, disrupted only by the rustling canopy and the faint insectoid hum of the electric vehicle's battery cooling matrix. I shifted my gaze upward toward the second story, floor-to-ceiling glass of Le Bernardin. Through the translucent veil of the drapes, I could discern the ghostly silhouettes of the elite raising their crystal goblets. Arthur the Billionaire was perched right there, undoubtedly savoring a mouthful of vintage Bordeaux. A smug, godlike smile warping his face as he hallucinated the glorious spectacle of his wife being ground into the filth. A sadistic smirk ghosted across my lips. Pressing my spine flush against the trunk, my hand plunged into my pocket and engaged the cipher. The billion-dollar digital fortress of modern security is ultimately nothing more than subservient binary code. Beep, dot, click. A microscopic, exquisitely refined mechanical whisper resonated from the trunk latch. Pivoting smoothly, I eased the trunk open. A suffocating thermal wave laced with the intoxicating aroma of bespoke Italian leather and the sickly, cloying perfume of the young mistress vomited out into my face. Stripped of all hesitation, I ripped back the floor liner and unceremoniously dumped the necrotic brick of drugs and its GPS tracker into the hollow cavity beside the spare tire. The dark red lead bled one final malevolent flash into the darkness before I violently slammed the lid down. Thump, a deep, hermetically sealed, flawless conclusion, 12 seconds. The entire violation had transpired beneath the glaring, unforgiving eye of the midday sun within the most parking sanctuary in the city, and absolutely no one suspected that Arthur's immaculate guillotine had just been seized and aimed directly at his own jugular. I retreated, resuming my languid stroll back to the pickup, and sealed the door behind me. Inside the cabin, Elena exhaled a long, ragged, shattered sigh, as though her lungs had been vacuum-sealed and were only just now reinflating with stolen oxygen. And then, The serene golden silence of the Manhattan noon was violently butchered. The sirens. It began as a spectral, high-pitched wail ricocheting off the glass canyons of the financial district. Then it swelled, morphing into a deafening, psychotic shriek. It drilled into the eardrums, pregnant with the terrifying absolute threat of state power. 4 New York Police Department cruisers descended with apocalyptic velocity, their tires screaming in agony as they locked up and drifted into the restaurant's entrance. The stench of incinerated rubber polluted the air. The manic rotation of red and blue strobes waged war against the blinding sunlight, inducing a dizzying, nausea-inducing visual chaos. Safe within the steel womb of the pickup, Elena and I observed the magnificent theatrical climax. The gilded glass doors of Le Bernardin were thrown open by a valet. Arthur, the megalomaniacal oligarch, draped in a flawless, wrinkle-free charcoal bespoke suit, strode out into the inferno. He was arm in arm with his nubile mistress, who was giggling vacantly in her designer slip. His aristocratic face was flushed with wine and the intoxicating euphoria of absolute victory. Pausing on the granite steps, he narrowed his eyes at the armada of police cruisers barricading his Tesla. Perhaps, in the final, pathetic microsecond of his blinding hubris, he genuinely believed the cavalry had arrived merely to offer a courteous salute and confirm the destruction of his thieving wife. He stood paralyzed, arrogantly twisting his solid gold cufflinks, awaiting a subservient bow. But the officers did not salute him. They drew their firearms. "Show me your hands! Get on the fucking ground!" "Do it now!" The commander's roar detonated through the bullhorn. The godlike arrogance plastered across Arthur's face flash froze, shattered and drained away, leaving behind a pallid, horrifying mask of incomprehension. He dropped his mistress, stumbling backward. 2 heavily armored tactical officers lunged like starving apex predators, twisting the collars of his exorbitant suit and violently wrenching his arms behind his back. With brutal, calculated malice, they slammed the billionaire face first into the scalding white hood of his Tesla. The searing metal baked under the midday sun seared into his cheek, forcing a pathetic, agonized shriek from his lungs. The cold, mechanical click-clack of steel cuffs ratcheted tightly around his wrists. Beside him, the mistress wailed in sheer hysteria, collapsing onto the asphalt as a female officer drove a knee into her spine. Exactly on cue, bursting from the manicured juniper hedges and the shadowy crevices of the lot, a plague of bottom-feeding paparazzi swarmed like blowflies to a fresh carcass. This was the exact mercenary army Arthur had personally financed to document his wife's humiliation. Now their massive telephoto lenses were shoved directly into the billionaire's grotesquely distorted, terror-stricken face and his blistered, reddened cheek. The mechanical chatter of shutters firing echoed like a firing squad. The blinding strobes of flash photography detonated relentlessly, slapping brutally against the widened, despairing eyes of a ruined god. The commanding officer marched to the rear of the Tesla, wedging a crowbar into the seal and violently popping the trunk. He ripped away the liner, plunged his hand into the void, and hoisted the vacuum-sealed, bloated brick of pure white cocaine, its core housing the stubbornly blinking red transponder. Ironclad, irrefutable evidence. Possession and trafficking of narcotics on a federal scale. Under the merciless, unforgiving glare of the summer sun, the empire, the prestige, the stock options, and the ungodly arrogance of the tycoon were pulverized into ash before an armada of media lenses. He thrashed impotently, his deranged eyes fixed upon the alien package of poison, screaming incoherent pleas of innocence over the deafening wail of the sirens. No one was listening. In the absolute judgment of the law and the press at that very moment, he was no longer an invincible titan of industry. He was a filthy, low-level federal convict. I turned my gaze to the passenger seat. Within the suffocating, cramped geometry of the truck, Elena was weeping. But these were no longer the tears of a broken, humiliated victim. The droplets carved clean paths through her ruined makeup, splashing onto the back of her hands, baptizing her in the cleansing waters of a resurrected life. She slowly, deliberately shrugged off the coarse canvas trench coat, discarding it into the rear cabin. The crimson silk emerged, torn, ravaged, still drenched in sweat, but it had been violently purged of its pathetic, hypersexualized degradation. It now hung upon her like a blood-drenched flag of absolute victory, planted triumphantly over the ashes of her oppressor. She inhaled deeply, her lungs expanding with the intoxicating air of freedom. Pure, unburdened, and wholly exonerated, I threw the transmission into drive and stomped the throttle. The Ford snarled, reversing sharply before slowly rolling back into the anonymous tide of the city, leaving behind a masterpiece of a trap that had successfully decapitated its own creator. You see, ungodly wealth can easily purchase elite alien-suited legal mercenaries. It can finance the most putrid, devastating smear campaigns to drown one's enemies. But there is a singular commodity that cash can never secure: the vigilance required when a predator believes they have already won. That billionaire was not annihilated by a lack of intellect. He died from an arrogance so dense it blinded him. He theorized that once his prey was backed to the edge of the cliff and stripped of her dignity, she would simply collapse and await the butcher's blade. He fatally miscalculated that the most catastrophic, apocalyptic weapon of mass destruction on this earth is a human being who has absolutely nothing left to lose. Now project yourself into Elena's blood-stained heels. Your flesh is burning, your dignity publicly vivisected on a crowded avenue. Would you have chosen the quiet, sanitized exit, walking away flanked by attorneys to pilfer half his monstrous fortune and rotting in a safe, gilded cage? Or would you have chosen her path, willingly wagering a life sentence just to pull the trigger yourself, standing in the shadows to watch your abuser burn his empire to the ground, forfeit everything to the state, and become a pathetic, humiliating joke to the entire world? Leave your verdict in the comments below. I have always harbored a sick fascination for dissecting the darkest corners of the human psyche. If you feel the frantic pulse of this psychological warfare pumping adrenaline through your veins, remember that out there the arrogant are still laying their traps every single day. And here, my pawn shop's doors remain wide open, always ready to broker the exchange of death sentences, until our next entanglement in the dark.